Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm Rose Campbell, Assistant Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. On October 25th, 2024, at the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona, President Biden formally apologized for the decades of abuse and neglect inflicted by the government-run boarding schools that forcibly attempted to assimilate Native American children into Euro-American culture and erase Indigenous culture across the United States for a century and a half. The apology, though an important step in addressing systemic violence against Native Americans, nevertheless highlights how frequently this violence has been ignored by U.S. government officials and policies. While the abuse and trauma of boarding schools has started to come to light over the past few decades, another form of violence remains largely invisible to much of the American public. Indigenous women in the United States are far more likely to be kidnapped or murdered than almost any other population group. And these incidents of violence are also far less likely to be reported. In 2016, the National Crime Information Center reported that there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls, but the federal missing persons database only reported 116. That same year, murder was the third leading cause of death among Indigenous women, and the murder rate among Native women living on reservations was nearly 10 times that of non-Native women and women living away from tribal reservations. The case of Jermaine Charlo was one of the few to attract national attention, and only after an episode of 48 Hours discussing her case was released in October 2024, 6 years after she disappeared. Many of the federal policies that funnel money to organizations aimed at helping and protecting women do little to help Native women. Joining us today to discuss this issue is Dr. Shannon Speed. Dr. Speed is a tribal citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma, the director of the American Indian Studies Center, and professor of gender studies and anthropology at UCLA. For the past 2 decades, her work has centered on Indigenous autonomy, gender, violence, and social justice in Mexico and the United States. She has written extensively about these topics in both English and Spanish, and her most recent book is a co-edited volume titled Indigenous Women and Violence: Feminist Activist Research in Heightened States of Injustice. Thank you so much for joining us today, Shannon.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
So you've worked for many years with Indigenous populations in both Mexico and the United States. How did you come to work in these regions? What led you to this research?
Well, my research in southern Mexico began during my doctoral studies. My first book came out of my doctoral dissertation. I had been planning when I returned to graduate school to work with my own tribal nation, the Chickasaw Nation. But the year that I began school was 1994, the year of the Zapatista uprising in southern Mexico. That was an armed indigenous insurgency in southern Mexico. And it really brought together so many of the things that I was interested in. I had studied Latin American studies. I had lived in Mexico. And this was an indigenous movement for social justice. It also had a strong gender justice component. And I had been doing human rights work, and I was really interested in the fact that indigenous people in this area were mobilizing a discourse of human rights and indigenous rights as part of their struggle, where I think in the decade prior, social struggles had much more used a discourse of liberation. So that was my research in Chiapas. And then after I completed that research, I was living in Central Texas. And 2 things were going on at that time around immigration. One was that the United States was increasingly incarcerating people for prolonged periods of time in an effort to dissuade further migrants from coming to the U.S. And we were seeing a rise in indigenous migration from Mexico and Central America. And so I got involved with an activist project that was going into the detention facilities to monitor conditions inside. And I, in particular, started going in to visit Indigenous women migrants who were in the facility. And through that work, they began telling me their stories as I visited. And it became clear to me that I wanted to write about those stories, which were largely about violence, multiple forms of violence that they had suffered. And I thought that these stories really told us a lot about sort of the state of the settler capitalist states that they had moved through on their migration journeys, including the United States. And so that became my second book.
So obviously these boundaries between Mexico and the United States are more recent and imposed, but what similarities and differences do you see historically in how these indigenous groups have interacted with colonizers? Because there were different groups of colonizers that came to various parts of North America and Central and South America.
Absolutely. So I would say that historically, the relationship to the settler state has differed primarily in the sense that in Mexico, that colonizers south of the settler-imposed border, principally Spain, did not engage in treaty making with the native peoples of the continent. The treaties in the United States, even though they were all abrogated in various ways, nevertheless served as a recognition of the existence of native nations as sovereign entities on this continent when Europeans arrived. And that recognition was partially subjugated through successive Supreme Court decisions over time that defined native nations as domestic dependent nations. In the U.S., tribal sovereignty and the trust relationship established in federal law are kind of key to tribes' relationship to the state. In Mexico, indigenous communities have been treated more as an ethnic minority population, which sets up a different set of sort of rights and responsibilities and issues. So all of that said, obviously, those are different contexts. But in my work, I've been interested in thinking about what is shared by indigenous peoples across the settler border. And in particular, I've highlighted the ways that settler capitalist structures have been similar in the US and Mexico with several kind of foundational aspects in common. So one, and these are basic tenets of settler colonialism, right? The settlers came and they stayed. So in some forms of colonialism, that's not what happens. With independence, the colonizer removes to the metropole and then there's independence. In Mexico, with independence, the settlers became the power in the country, right? Also, this in turn requires dispossession of indigenous peoples of their lands, right? Which is also a fundamental part of, that settler colonial project. And it's a fundamental aspect of the landscape of occupied indigenous peoples in both countries, right? Also, both sets of colonizers deployed race and gender ideologies, by which I mean specifically white supremacy and patriarchy, to manage and to justify kind of ongoing colonial occupation and dispossession, as well as capitalist exploitation. So those may look different in the two countries, but racial mixing and forced assimilation were key tools in the settlers' toolbox in both places, right? So there's a lot of shared aspects to both our structural and our ideological worlds as occupied peoples.
So let's shift our focus a little bit to Native women. Why are Indigenous women in particular at such increased risk? And maybe you can start by talking a little bit historically why that was the case, and then moving closer towards the present.
Sure. So in the United States, there were a series of laws and Supreme Court decisions that contributed to a situation of lack of accountability for violence against Indigenous women. So I think I think we can say that for both countries, the ideological underpinnings of settler capitalism, again, white supremacy and patriarchy, set up a situation in which Indigenous women are understood in a particular way that renders them vulnerable to violence, right? So historically, Indigenous women were constructed as both kind of the savage, uncivilized, inherently violent-natured Indigenous people, and Indigenous women were also ideologically constructed through various types of narratives as sort of rapeable, right? Like subject to sexual violence. So those things still circulate in popular culture today, right? And so you see things like hypersexualized representations of Indigenous women in everything from, movie representations to Halloween costumes, right? So there's that kind of ideological component to it that I think renders women, sort of vulnerable to violence. And then there are very real structural things like laws that, in particular in the United States, there's been a pretty strong focus on what we talk about as the jurisdictional issue in Indian country, where laws have systematically, in an effort to limit Indigenous sovereignty, have eliminated the ability of tribal law enforcement and tribal courts to investigate or prosecute people for violence against women in their tribal contexts. And in particular, the Oliphant v. Suquamish Supreme Court decision, which said that tribal courts could not try non-Indians in their courts. And it really fairly severe limitations were put on sentencing ability as well for the few things that tribal courts could prosecute people for. So that set up a situation in which, basically it was up to the federal government to investigate and prosecute, which by their own statistics, they declined to do in like 70% to 80% of cases. So it was pretty much, this led to what, people have regularly referred to in recent years as open season on Indian women. I mean, people just knew they could carry out this violence and nobody was going to do anything about it.
You've touched on this a little bit with the lack of willingness to investigate some of these cases, but what other factors do you think contribute specifically to the public's ignorance about this particular form of violence, as well as the government's silence? Why aren't they pursuing these cases, and why aren't these cases gaining the attention of particularly other women who are kidnapped or murdered or suffer violence at the hands of others?
Again, I think it's ideological. I think, there's a significant component of racism here. I mean, Indigenous women have been constructed as not valuable, right? And so, I mean, simply it's naturalized that this violence is conducted, and people don't take it up. The press, for example, doesn't generally take it up as an issue that people will be concerned with, right? And the women have been systematically devalued in such a way that people don't really take it as a serious issue. In the congressional debates around VAWA, and we should talk about VAWA reforms in a minute, but there were some pretty explicit. Not everybody was in favor of those reforms, which strengthened the ability of tribes to investigate and prosecute crimes, gender crimes. And so there was some pretty overt discourse around devaluing Native women in that context. So, these things are often subtle, kind of under the radar, but they spring to the surface quickly when issues, get debated publicly around increasing tribal sovereignty.
So can you talk a little more broadly, you mentioned VAWA, for example, about some of the federal and state policies that are designed to protect women, like the Violence Against Women Act, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, or the Victims of Crime Act, among others. What are these laws intended to do, and how well do they work, just broadly?
Sure. So in recent years, some reform efforts have been made to address the jurisdictional vacuum in Indian country that I was just talking about. The 2010 Tribal Law and Order Act, for example, expanded the punitive abilities of tribal courts across the nation by increasing that sentencing capacity in criminal cases. Was a significant step toward improving enforcement and justice in Indian country. There have also been two significant advances through the reauthorization processes of the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. So in 2013, Congress partially abrogated the court's holding in Oliphant v. Suquamish when it enacted the the Reauthorization Act of the VAWA Reauthorization of 2013 by attaching essentially a rider to the bill with a provision that affirmed the inherent sovereignty of the inherent sovereign authority, I guess, of Indian tribal governments to exercise criminal jurisdiction over certain non-Indians who violate, I think it was specifically protection orders or commit certain forms of gender violence. This provision was known as the Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction, and it created a framework for tribal courts to then prosecute non-Indians again, which had been removed by Suquamish and by Oliphant. So then in 2022, the VAWA reauthorization expanded that criminal jurisdiction of tribal courts to cover non-Native perpetrators for a much broader range of crimes that included things like sexual assault and stalking, child abuse, sex trafficking, when it happened on tribal land. So those did significantly expand Native sovereign ability to prosecute. Things like the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act and the Victims of Crime Act both designate federal funds to tribes for services. So the first one specifically for things like shelters. So that can be important if your tribe is accessing the funds and making the services available. They do help some people, but I'll note that this doesn't stem the violence, and it hasn't changed the statistics, nor have the VAWA reauthorizations for that matter. And many tribes don't have the infrastructure necessary to implement those kinds of services. So, and further, many more are not federally recognized, and so can't even access the funds. One other change happened recently that I think has been important in this regard, and that was the McGirt v. Oklahoma Supreme Court decision, in which the court held that the reservation boundaries of the so-called five civilized tribes, or the Trail of Tears tribes, had never been abrogated by Oklahoma statehood, and thus they stand as contemporary reservations, which meant that the state of Oklahoma lost the ability to prosecute in those areas, which is about a fifth of the state of Oklahoma, and our tribes gained the sovereign ability to hold jurisdiction. In our tribal court for Chickasaw, for example, in the first year after the McGirt decision, we went from having about 200 criminal cases come through our courts to having over 2,000 come through our courts. The majority of those were gender-based crime cases. So it significantly expanded our ability to prosecute those cases. That was later ratcheted back somewhat by another court decision that gave some ability to prosecute back to the state of Oklahoma. And today, what generally happens is that when somebody is arrested for a crime in Indian country, there's a negotiation between the federal prosecutors, the state prosecutors, and the tribal prosecutors to decide who will prosecute the detained. So it's an interesting negotiation of sovereignty in that space today. But I will say also that I haven't seen any really clear evidence that any of those changes have lessened the violence against women in Indian country. So, and I have real concerns about whether the increased ability to investigate and prosecute might, not lessen the violence and really just end up incarcerating a lot more people and rendering our tribes, part of the carceral system in ways that concern me. So I think we need to be paying close attention to that.
That is quite sobering, I have to say. And you've touched on a little bit of my next question with issues of federal recognition of tribes and, some tribes being recognized, others not. But even when tribes are recognized, maybe not dispersing the funding that they receive. So could you talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls in these policies that are designed to fund services for Indigenous women, but then either these women are accessing the funds from the tribes or the tribes aren't able to access the funds? You've also talked about jurisdiction. Can you talk about some of the reasons why these aren't working, why they're not preventing violence against women?
I can try. I think there are practical reasons, as you say. Federal recognition or lack thereof might be one of them. So if tribes that are not federally recognized can't access them at all as entities, tribes that do have access to them may not have the infrastructure to distribute them appropriately, or they might be not making their way to women for a variety of reasons through those channels. Another major issue is that lack of reporting in gender violence cases is massive, right? So women have to be willing to report to be able to access these resources. And in many cases, they simply aren't. Women in Indian country don't believe that reporting will benefit them in any way. And so they simply don't do it. And so those are all sort of real challenges. And I think, in an overarching sense, these are remedies, these are Band-Aids, right? The two federal programs that give resources are basically to help somebody after they've been subject to the violence, but we aren't doing anything to address what's generating the violence, right? Which is both structural and ideological. And so I did a recent piece that'll be in the Journal of Anthropological Research soon, where I'm looking at sort of what might actually end the violence against Native women, since I don't see that any of our sort of Band-Aids are helping. And I'm concerned about just increased policing and incarceration as a remedy. And so I sort of looked at putting together both a tribal sovereignty framework with a human rights framework that holds the state accountable. In particular, I was drawing on the report, the Canadian report on the inquiry into the missing and murdered women and girls in that country, which was an extensive report over 1,000 pages long. And in the report, the people involved in the inquiry did a couple of interesting things. I mean, they departed from human rights framework, and they argued that the violence against women in that country, which is extreme as it is in the United States, was really a product of settler colonial state power, and they held the state. They called it a state-sponsored genocide, and they were using a human rights framework to try to hold the state accountable for failing to protect Indigenous women from these forms of violence, and by which they did not just mean more effectively punishing perpetrators. They meant changing the conditions that rendered Indigenous women vulnerable to that violence in the first place. So I thought that was a really interesting argument. And there are problems with, questions of enforcement of human rights, norms and that kind of thing. But I made this argument. I combined it with an argument about tribal courts and what I see as something different in what has been called, a third jurisdictional space in addition to the federal and the state, and that of tribal courts, where in Chickasaw, at least, I think there is an ethics of care and relationality that are characterize the Indigenous space that are brought to bear in these cases. So, in our courts, what that means is that when people are brought into court, they are treated with respect, and a variety of different service agencies are there in the court. There's a real examination of what brought perpetrators to be in the position that they're in, to be in the low place where they are being brought through the courts, and to really help them bring the services necessary to help them make change in their lives so that they can re-enter society and their families in a healthful way. And I think there's some hope there that kind of interaction is more likely to stem violence by addressing underlying conditions that relate to colonial occupation, so that people can change their behaviors.
That makes sense, stemming the cause of the violence rather than simply putting a Band-Aid over it. we've seen this with women across the United States of all groups, right? They are reluctant to report violence because they don't receive support or they're not believed. And it sounds like it's exacerbated by all of these policies affecting Indigenous groups across North America, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, reporting isn't just like a matter of picking up a phone and talking to someone and saying, this happened to me. I mean, those processes and investigative processes can be quite violent in and of themselves.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So let's shift gears just a little bit. I'd love to hear more about your recent work, which looks at the many dangers faced by Latin American women, especially migrant women. Could you talk in a little more detail about this work and what parallels or differences you've seen between this group of migrant women and other Indigenous women of North America?
Sure. I think the similarities really are there in both sort of the structural and the ideological realms, right? That these structural and ideological the ways that the structural and ideological worlds kind of work together to render Indigenous women vulnerable in similar ways across these settler spaces. It's hard to say that Indigenous women migrants are more vulnerable when Native American women in the United States suffer near total vulnerability, but there are some specific things to keep in mind about migrant women. As migrants, they're less likely to have family and community or tribal support or protection, right? And so they're sort of rendered even more vulnerable by being out there on their own. And they are often in particular types of situations where their vulnerability is increased, like, border crossings, for example, or custody situations. And they also may be even more reluctant or have other reasons to be reluctant from non-migrant women to report violence they've experienced, right? Because they have fear of retaliation and fear of deportation. So, they are rendered vulnerable in similar ways, but also, in some very specific ways that are particular to the migration experience.
So in your own work, what benefits have you seen from approaching the issue of violence against Indigenous groups and especially Indigenous women through this historical perspective, looking at the history of settler colonialism into the present?
So I think my goals in looking at it historically and kind of from a macro level is really, because it renders those structural and ideological, dynamics more visible, right? So if we're looking at a particular snapshot in time, we might not see how those are working across the full panorama of settler states, right? So we have several hundred years of settler state. And, the ways that, say, race and gender or white supremacy and patriarchy are deployed differ across time and across space. But they have consistently been deployed visibly consistently been deployed to facilitate the ongoing colonial dispossession and occupation, as well as capitalist exploitation. And, capitalism changes over time. It goes through phases. And so those ideological underpinnings do different work at different times to meet the needs of capitalism. So an overarching argument of the second book the book on Indigenous women migrants, which was called Incarcerated Stories. One of the overarching arguments was that settler states emerged to facilitate the expansion of capitalism, and settler states continue to evolve based on meeting the needs of settler capitalism. And I think we can see that happening in the United States right now as sort of neoliberalism experiences a crisis as a phase of capitalism, and the settler state is having to adapt, and it's thrown us into political crisis as we try to shift gears to meet the ongoing needs of capitalism.
Any final thoughts about what we can do to be a more educated and engaged public and do something to help Indigenous women?
Well, obviously, I think it's extremely important that we continue to try to raise awareness of the violence that's being perpetrated against Indigenous women. Advocacy work on behalf of Indigenous women can be really, really important in terms of, mitigating the harms, the ongoing harms of this violence. I think in terms of ending violence against Indigenous women, we need to be looking at the larger kind of structural and ideological issues that are rendering women vulnerable, Indigenous women vulnerable in an ongoing way in our societies.
Well, thank you for those thoughts. I'd like to thank you again for joining us and for sharing this really rich perspective on this issue that is not talked about nearly enough. So thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.